Hello and welcome to our video series on the existence of God. One of the reasons why some do not believe in God's existence is because of the existence of pain and suffering in the world. They argue that if God is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent, then there ought to be no pain and suffering in the world. But the fact of the matter is that there is tremendous amount of pain and suffering in the world. Most of them quite unnecessary, they claim. Therefore, they argue God does not exist. This argument against God's existence from pain and suffering can be formulated as follows. Premise 1. God is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent. Premise 2. An omnipotent being can create any world he wants to, including a world without pain and suffering. Premise 3. An omniscient being knows how to prevent pain and suffering. Premise 4. An omnibenevolent being prefers a world without pain and suffering. Premise 5. Pain and suffering exists. From premise 2, 3, 4, and 5, therefore, an omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent being does not exist. Conclusion. Therefore, God does not exist. Now, this is a valid argument for sure, but is it sound? Are the premises more plausibly true than false? I don't think so. Let's take a look at each of the premises. There is nothing wrong with the first premise. God is certainly omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent. That is who God is. What about the second premise? An omnipotent being can create any world he wants to, including a world without pain and suffering. This is not necessarily true, particularly if it's possible that people in such a world have free will. It is logically impossible to make people do something freely. In a world of free creatures, there is no guarantee that there will be no pain and suffering, for people may freely choose to cause pain and suffering on others. What about the third premise? It is true because an omniscient being certainly knows how to prevent pain and suffering. However, the fourth premise, which says an omnibenevolent being prefers a world without pain and suffering, is not necessarily true, because the omnibenevolent God could have other overriding reasons for allowing pain and suffering in the world. Think about it. Don't we sometimes permit suffering in order to achieve some greater good? Like in the treatment of diseases. We certainly do. So it is not necessarily true that an all-good being prefers a world without pain and suffering. Therefore, premise 4 is not necessarily true. Taking the whole argument together then, since premise 1 and premise 4 are not necessarily true, the conclusion, namely that God does not exist, does not logically follow. Hence, the argument falls apart. Sometimes, however, it is argued that while the existence of pain and suffering in the world is not logically incompatible with the existence of God, it is, however, highly improbable given the unnecessary pain and suffering in the world. However, firstly, it must be noted that we are not in a good position to say that it is improbable that God has good reasons for permitting pain and suffering in the world. Think about it. Just because the suffering looks unjustified from our perspective, it isn't necessarily unjustified at all. We would need a God-like perspective to make that judgment. Only an all-knowing God could grasp the complexities of directing a world of free people toward His previsioned ends. Secondly, if Christianity is true, then it's not surprising at all that there would be a lot of pain and suffering in the world. The Bible tells us that mankind is in a state of rebellion against God and His purpose. You read that in Mark chapter 10, Romans chapter 3, and Romans chapter 1 as well. Let's take Romans chapter 1 verse 24 and 26 and even 28. The Apostle Paul says, quote, God gave them up to their wickedness, end quote. The terrible human evils are a testimony to how depraved and alienated we are from God's purpose. So the Christian isn't surprised at all. This is exactly what we would expect if Christianity were true. Let's draw this to a conclusion. The existence of pain and suffering in the world fails as an argument against God's existence. The argument is based on faulty assumptions that render them unsound and finally untenable. Thank you so much for watching, and God bless you.